thanks for coming, everyone, this morning. It's great to be with you and for you all to join us. We find ourselves, don't we? I'm sure you'd agree, in a time quite unlike anything we've ever experienced before, and who knows, might ever experience again. These past 15 months have been something of a quantum leap, a season of huge upheaval and transition in our own lives as people involved in leadership in the life of the church in Ireland, as well as in the lives of our churches. And as, like Lucy was saying, as life and society starts to reopen into a new normal, we find ourselves asking all kinds of questions, which is the purpose of these online Praxis gatherings, to find friends to journey with where possible, and to draw in some trusted outside voices to help us to reflect more clearly on how to lead at this time, how to discern the sorts of questions we should be asking, particularly in terms of how to make sense of the new opportunities this season is presenting our churches. So we're going to be hearing from Mark about his learnings from his Australian context and experience. He's involved in the life of a church called Red Church, and even encourage him to speak to us more generally in terms of what he senses has been shifting in our culture at this time. So I was laughing with the guys earlier on. I have to dial down my bromance. I'm a massive Mark Sayers fan. If you haven't read this book, Reappearing Church, there's a one that came before called The Disappearing Church. They've been a huge tool for me and a massive shape on my thinking, and I'm grateful for that. So let's pray for Mark, and then we'll just hand straight over to him. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to be together today, and for everything that you're doing in our lives, whether we can name it all or not. Lord, we trust you for where we find ourselves and for what's next. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Mark, over to you, mate.
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be joining with everyone today. And I was in Ireland in 2019, which seems like a lifetime ago with everything that's happened in the last little while. But I was really keen to share with you today. I'm actually, writing a book, and I'm sort of on this study break at the moment. So it's part holiday, part writing. So I'm writing in the morning and then having a break in the afternoon. But I cancelled a number of bookings that I was going to do to have this break. But I wanted to keep doing this one. That's not to make me sound special, like I'm some hero for doing this in the midst of my holidays. Rather, I just wanted to say that at the beginning, because I think that's also my estimation of you, and my real sense of saying yes to this and speaking to you all today is hopefully that you pick up of something that I think there's actually something special happening in your country, and perhaps more special, so God is doing something amongst you than perhaps you realize. So I just wanted to begin with that. I guess the word that I'm sort of speaking into today is recovery. And recovery has really two meanings. There is the sense of recovery in healing after you've experienced the trauma. And in many ways, that's something I think we can all identify with, this healing after this period that we've gone through in the last 15 months, which has completely changed the world. But then there's also this sense of recovery means to retrieve something, to actually find something that has been forgotten. They talk about recovering a ship that has sunk to the bottom of the ocean. And in a sense, I sort of wanted to touch particularly on that second meaning, as I prayed into this, has emerged more for me. And I think that's partially too, because in a sense, like when I first said yes to this, and I think we're chatting on email and booking this in, there's a sense of the experience of we in Australia were in the position where we've taken, us in New Zealand have taken quite a unique approach to the pandemic. It's probably similar to some of the Asian countries where we just completely closed our borders. To fly to Australia, you've got to go into hotel quarantine for 2 weeks. Basically, our Prime Minister said that they're shutting the border. If you're an Australian, you need to get home now. And it's been a really interesting time where Australia's been cut off from the world. And particularly for someone like me who travels, I'm in the Northern Hemisphere a lot. It's been a really interesting time where in the last 15 months, I have not gone further than 2 hours from my house for a lot of that time. I think we had a lockdown for 115 days here in Melbourne, and we couldn't go more than 5 kilometers from our house. So it's this really weird, interesting time of being local. So, in a sense, what I was going to talk about, I think originally was this idea of, well, what are we learning as a church as we then opened up? So, in January, we started to open up again and then had this process that we're able to sort of reconfigure as a church, which was a really interesting time. And then perhaps sharing with you guys, what's it like to be a little bit further down the road. But it's COVID, and here I am in newly locked down Melbourne in our fourth lockdown, in our fourth wave as the countries in Asia, which were being the sort of champions of COVID response early on, such as Taiwan and Singapore, South Korea, Japan, are all now experiencing another wave with what's been called the Indian variants. And I was speaking to a pastor friend in Delhi just the other day, and he described what's happening in Asia as a completely different disease. And we're seeing something that's changing. And even our chief medical officer was talking about just on the news I just watched before, how in many ways this new variant is acting in this very different way. It's going to change things. So in some sense, I don't feel like I'm further down the road. I'm in a different place. And this idea that we have that we want to bounce back and come back to some sort of new sense of a new normal, we don't seem to arrive at. So the term I've been using is actually, I haven't been using the new normal because it's overused and things do not feel normal at this moment. Really, the term I've been using, which I think has been resonating with me, is actually this term I would call a grey zone. And the reason I call it a grey zone, if you think about a grey zone, if you can imagine a Venn diagram of two circles and there's an overlap, in a sense, the first circle is where we were before, and then the next circle is where we're going to be after this. But we're in this weird in-between space. And when we did have that time where we came back and we were able to have 86 days here in Melbourne with no coronavirus and basically life went back to normal, reconstituting at a church, it was just so strange. I found myself regularly saying to my wife, sort of late at night, like everything has changed so phenomenally. We found people who I thought were really solid and I thought would be traveling with us as a church for a long time, actually didn't come back. I had people who, I sort of led with and been doing ministry with who left without saying anything. And it was a really strange experience. We had other people who were turn up to church every week type people who then have fallen out of the pattern. We had people who deconstructed faith. Weirdly, we had then people who were on the edge of church, and you would say they were quite fringy in their faith, become really serious in their faith. We had people who didn't have faith come to faith, and then we had a whole bunch of new people turn up who joined us who we'd never seen before. So the experience as we were regathering, and as that sort of, over a few months of that, was that really it was almost a completely different church and a different situation that I was dealing with. But it continually felt strange, and you never felt like you were getting into this rhythm. And then here again in our fourth lockdown, yet again that pattern feels like it's broken. So for me, this sense that we're in a grey zone is a really important, I think, interpretive framework to hold and actually understand, because really in many ways what a grey zone is this transitional space. I borrowed the word grey zone actually from military sort of strategy, is a word that's used increasingly these days. It first sort of was used a lot when in 2014 in the Crimea in the Ukraine, you had this strange occurrence where all of a sudden they called them the mysterious green men turned up. And so these guys turned up in uniforms and they had no badges. They weren't really speaking, but they just turned up at all these various military installations in Crimea, and no one knew exactly what was happening. At the same time, there was a number of cyber attacks happening against different parts of Ukraine, and people were asking the question, is this war? Is it not war? And traditionally, how we've understood war, that was very clear definitions of when a war had begun, and there was very clear definitions of when a war had stopped. You had VE Day, you had, which is Victory in Europe Day, where you see those famous pictures of people celebrating when World War II ended and sailors kissing women in the street. And there's this clear moment when a peace declaration was signed and a war ended. There was a clear moment when the President of the United States declared war. I think it may have been March 4th, I'm guessing, May 4th, I can't remember, but there was a particular time, it was like something like 3:30, the United States went to war with Japan and the Axis forces. But the strange thing that happened in Ukraine in this moment where you had these people turn up and people did not know, what is this? We have no way of categorizing, is this war, is this not? And what they worked out is there's this gray zone in between war and peace. And you've seen this phenomenon all around the world at the moment with cyber attacks. There's fishing fleets of Chinese fishing boats that are coming close to islands in the South China Sea. And people ask the question, are we in war? Are we not in war? And so I think that's a really helpful term to sort of look at this stage that we're in at this moment, which is actually this sort of gray zone. So the first thing I guess I would say is if you're expecting things to return to normal, I don't think that things are going to return to normal. Any sense of normality as we understood them before. And for me, there was an element of having to sort of learn that, and in a sense, my person who reads culture could understand that. But there's also a personal sense where I had to sort of almost grieve. And I know in the last one of these, I think you spent some time with Jill Weber reflecting on what actually has been lost. And that's also been a loss of life. That's also been a loss of health for people. So there's been this sense of loss that goes with that and what was not returning. But in a sense, too, I think what I'd also like to share is that grey zone is actually this really interesting space once you come to accept it. If you look at how God grows us, Dr. Bobby Clinton, who for many years was at Fuller and taught on leadership, spoke about leaders develop, and we tend to develop in the wilderness spaces in between different stages of ministry and contribution that we have in our lives. And often those in-between spaces are the most painful, often they're the most confusing, often they're the most disorientating. But when you look back, they're moments where we're actually forced into a deeper dependency on God, where often the word comes in the wilderness. And there's a link there that if you think about it, there's a sense where a grey zone is in many ways analogous to a biblical sense of the wilderness. And there's a sense where we don't like wilderness, particularly so much of what the modern world has been based on is that humans actually conquered the wilderness. When lots of people came from Europe to Australia around the beginning of white settlement in Australia, and many Irish people came here, people were literally terrified by the Australian wilderness. It was this frightening place. It was a wild place filled with all kinds of different creatures and animals. And one of the things that you saw European settlement do all over the world was, in a sense, try and push back nature, because at the basis of that sort of European idea of framework of viewing the world was that humans had transcended actually the environment, and humans had transcended nature. And because humans had transcended nature, in a sense, we had taken the place of God, and we could create this world and this life where humans could flourish because we had triumphed over nature. But as Bruno Maçães, the Portuguese writer and former politician, said, in many ways, what COVID-19 has been is the return of nature. And in a sense, the fact that nature actually, we haven't triumphed over nature, which actually opens up a little bit of a theological door, which I'll come back to, or rather an evangelistic opening. So in many ways, as the pandemic has progressed, I realize more and more, it's not the question of how will the world be changed after COVID-19. Rather, the question is, COVID-19 is the sign that the world is changing. I'm just going to repeat that. The question I've realized is not, what does the world look like after COVID-19? The question is, COVID-19 is a sign, the statement is COVID-19 is a sign that the world is changing. In many ways, the pandemic is the preparation. And I just want to go back to a story, a moment that happened to me in 2019. And I had this really sort of strange moment where for many years, what I've been doing is talking in places around the world. And I've been preparing people for the birth of this new progressive moment, this secular moment that was happening in many cities around the world. And I was helping churches deal with this new reality. and so would speak in LA and New York and London and these different places. And I had this really interesting moment where I was in New York, and I was at my friend's building he has in New York, and I was on the roof, and I'd finished speaking for the day, talking about the fact that basically, God wanted to bring this renewal. The book was shown before Repairing Church. Really, I'd released that book, and was talking about it, and it was going around the world speaking about the fact that, asking God to have this renewal in this secular moment. And as I was sitting on top of this building in Midtown in Manhattan, I had this incredible sense from God that actually an era was coming to an end. And it was quite sort of shocking. And I sat there for 2 hours, and the sun went down, and here I was in sort of the hub city of the world, in this global network where everything sort of goes out from New York, all the different entertainment and power and money and finance. And I felt like something was about to shift. And so many people had gotten used to the last shift, which was the shift to this progressive secular world. But actually, another kind of shift was coming. And the real sense that I had was actually post-Christianity, which Ireland is dealing with, this new sort of reality that has come on what was formerly seen as a very religious country decades ago. That in a sense, post-Christianity, which everyone was just getting used to, and I was able to go around the world and talk about and get everyone used to this new era, that actually that new era itself was about to be disrupted. And I think that actually COVID is the beginning of this. COVID is the shock that something has changed in the world. And in many ways, if you think about it, that global network that went out from New York, that goes across the world, connects us through international travel, was actually the piggyback. The virus piggybacked on the back of this global network, which was created to make us feel comfortable, and in many ways made us feel like we could jet around the world, almost like demigods, not needing God. But here we are locked down and not moving. And so in many ways, if you look at where we're going from here, it's not like if you just have a cursory glance over the big trends in the world, the structural things that are happening, that life's going to return to what it looked like in 2019. The historian Noel Ferguson said that COVID will begin as a medical crisis and then become an economic crisis. So there's all kinds of things happening in the economy as we print money, and possibly the return of inflation. There's the disruption of cryptocurrencies, which in many ways undermines the legitimacy of the nation state. In some ways, if you think about it, I think the political upheaval that was seen in the world, that even saw in the last Irish election, that you're seeing around the world, where different more fringe parties are having more of a say. There's this increasing protest movement, where there's this incredible discontent that is felt all over the world, and a legitimacy crisis that all kinds of institutions and governments and bodies around the world are experiencing. All of these are disruptive shocks that are going on in the world at the moment. In Melbourne, in January 2020, people were wearing masks before the pandemic because we were experiencing incredible, devastating bushfires, the scale of which was almost impossible to comprehend. Incredible, millions of hectares of bushland was burnt. And if you read about where the world and predict out some of the changes that are going to happen in the environment going forward, is the return of nature is not just going to happen through COVID-19, but it's also going to happen through an environment which is radically changing going forward, which is going to affect every person in the world. You see the interplay between all of these things, between shocks in the economy, political shocks, shocks in the environment, and we're seeing that happening already with things like the global supply chain, which facilitates this comfortable world, is being shook. I had this idea, I had this question of, what is the people? So early in 2020, I was following different sort of futurist people who were predicting the pandemic, and they were miles ahead and predicted stuff really early. So I had this thought like about a month ago. I thought, what are they predicting now? And so I went and had a look, and what they're predicting now is what they're calling the digital pandemic, which is the idea that large parts of the internet could go down, and they're already future-proofing this. And we're seeing this with various ransomware attacks, like what happened to the Irish health system recently, what we saw happen to oil production on the east coast of the United States. The largest beef producer in the United States, Canada, and Australia has been attacked by ransomware. at this point in time. And you're seeing this global network, which we thought would just power us to this more sort of comfortable future, is being shaken. So that sounds quite disruptive. And in many ways it is. But the reason I go on this global little tour there of what's ahead of us is I believe this is actually going to shake the direction of where we thought things were heading. In many ways, if you look at the Republic of Ireland, there's been a journey where for many years Ireland was seen as this, very religious, very Catholic nation. But then, particularly in the last sort of few decades, there's been this huge shift and a drop off, obviously, in connection to the Catholic Church, in religious attendance, and then almost this backlash and revolt against the Catholic Church, and the emergence of what you would call a progressive Ireland, a progressive secular Ireland, where there's almost been this like revolution that's happened, and particularly with the referendum that I think occurred in 2018 around abortion, it was almost this public backlash, against that. So in many ways, how people have been predicting and telling the story, and this is almost the story I've been telling, not just about Ireland, but around the world, is what we're going to see is this continual progressive reality. And what that means is, therefore, for churches, it's how do we be resilient in this progressive future? But I think everything that I've just outlined, and I think the beginning of the COVID period actually says that trajectory of the future, I think, is actually going to be very possibly disrupted. Ronald Engelhardt, who is sort of an evolution, I think they call him a cultural evolutionist who looks at the evolution of cultures. He has this thing of what he calls a survival scale. And if you look at a survival scale, countries where people have less material needs, where people feel safer, where people feel that their life is not threatened, where they're able to count on 3 square meals a day, where they have healthcare, you find that there's also a corresponding secularization that goes with it. And I think in Fraser's book, I think I saw Fraser here, Down with That Sort of Thing, he talks about the fact that in Ireland, that particularly around the time of the Celtic Tiger, that's also links in Ireland's economic boom, that also links to the growth of progressivism in Ireland. But it's a really interesting question that if we're heading into a period where COVID is the first of a number of shocks, and a number of shocks which actually may change that survival scale, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what that's doing is actually possibly moving us down. So my friend Katie Isles, who does research here in Australia, was recently during the pandemic doing research with a number of Gen Z here in Australia. And what they found was in 2019, their view of the world was much higher up that survival scale, up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but now it's come right down. The questions they're asking is, how do I be safe in the future? How do I have enough money if something goes wrong? And I think this is actually an indicator that if this is a decade of shocks in this gray zone between the era that has been ending, which has been an era which really I think you would put since the end of the end of the Cold War. We had American ascendancy in the world. You had a growing economy. You had the internet age, but that's all up in the air now with all these different shocks that's happening. And so I think this actually asks a question then of how do we lead in a different way? If the pandemic is the preparation, what then has the pandemic been teaching us? So much of leading and how we think about leading is based on a model where we assume that we can predict what things are going to be, that actually the environment that we're in is fairly predictable and stable, and therefore we can have a plan and then we can execute the plan and have success. But what we've all learned across the world is you can't even count on the fact that you're having a church service this week with people in a room, because things change so quickly and so radically. And so what this is doing is actually inviting us into a different kind of leading. So the pandemic is the preparation. But my last point, and I do want to leave some time for questions, I've got a few subpoints under this last point. So the pandemic is the preparation, but I want to reframe something for you. The pandemic is the preparation, but what if also the Republic of Ireland is the preparation? The pandemic is the preparation, but what if the Republic of Ireland is also the preparation? One of the most fascinating for people like me who look at things like secularism, but one of the most difficult soils in the West to do ministry and mission in is in a secular culture, but particularly a post-Catholic secular culture, where there's been a wholesale sort of religious rejection, or a rejection of religion in the culture, and then the taking on of a very coherent sort of secular identity, which posits itself as the moral new order versus the immoral previous religious order. That's a really tough environment. Probably the Republic has that in common with Quebec. And so what we've seen is a similar process happening in Quebec, in Canada, and in the Republic of Ireland. And so the Republic of Ireland then finds itself, and I think Fraser in his book did this really well, of like, you've got the older brother who is, traditional religious Ireland, and then you've got the younger brother who's sort of progressive secular Ireland. And he used in that book then the example of the father in the story of the prodigal son, comparing, using that as a metaphor. I just wanted to use it in another way. Tertullian talked about the gospel as always being caught in between, just as Jesus was on the cross, in between irreligion and religiosity. And so I just want to posit that actually, is Ireland also a preparation, because the context that people find themselves in is in this incredible laboratory at the utter coalface and cutting edge of what it is to do ministry in this really, really tough place. And when you're doing things on the fringe, that's actually where the innovations come from. And so to also do that, I think in a world which increasingly, in a disrupted world, people are going to turn to two things. I think one thing that's going to do, what we saw after the 1918 pandemic in the Spanish flu, is you saw in the 1920s, and Nicholas Christakis has just written a book about this, where basically you saw this big burst. There was the roaring 20s. You saw this uptick in irreligiosity. You saw, if you've seen the series Babylon Berlin, you saw this, really sort of almost quite similar to our day, where sexual norms were thrown out. You saw this blending of genders. You saw all this sort of stuff going on. But at the same time, you also saw this uptake in religiosity. And what we're seeing in the culture, it is this element that in the progressive secularism, there's an element which is religiosity, but there's also an element which is irreligiosity at the same time. It's really interesting. And so in many ways, does being in Ireland actually prepare you for that reality in a way that it doesn't to other people in the world, because that's the milieu in which you've been growing up. It's been forming you without you realizing. And so in many ways, what I've been telling people is, one of the big things that I was advocating before 2020 was that one of the ways the church can stay resilient is through taking on practices. That if we can actually have these practices which form us according to the kingdom in the gospel, in contrast to the ways that the culture's practices of consumerism or looking at your phone shape us. But I realized with the pandemic that what it did is it broke our patterns. It actually disabled our practices. I remember really early in the pandemic going for a walk and bumping into a guy from my church who is an Iranian asylum seeker in our country. He's just trying to keep his business going. And he said to me, how do I do a Sabbath well? And, at a time when I'm trying to keep my business going in a pandemic, it's so difficult, all these sort of, questions he had. And it made me realize that actually when you have a disruptive moment, you can't always keep doing your practices, but actually what you can do is keep a posture. That actually the posture isn't reliant on the environment staying the same. Practices rely on the environment staying the same. Postures actually are translocational, trans-environmental, trans-time. If you have the right posture directed towards God, then you can choose the right practice for that moment. And I actually wonder if actually what God has been doing in the difficult soil is that actually God has been shaping a posture in Ireland of believers. There's a resiliency, there's a not taking yourself too seriously, but also, and this is where my last point, does this all point to a more disrupted future, a church on the edge, a new opportunity, being part of a laboratory, being on the coalface, we're not even realizing it? Does this also point to that the recovery is not just a healing, after the disruption of the pandemic. But actually, the recovery is a retrieval of something further back in your DNA and the role that your nation has played throughout its history of something much, much deeper. And actually, the recovery of that deeper tradition of how God has used Ireland at different times of global upheaval, that actually there's a recovery of something, a gift in the midst of that. There's actually a manner that couldn't be missed in the moment, but that God actually wants to not just return to make everything go back to what it was, but he's used this gray zone moment, this transitional moment, to actually point you back to something that can be rediscovered and reused, not just in Ireland, but further afield, as we need leaders in this world who are able to operate in a moment of great disruption. I've said about 70,000 things, so I'll stop now. For questions.
Yeah, no, I know we're all stunned in silence, Mark. I think, Mark, would you mind? I just was texting Owen there, and I feel like there's been so much in that is really helpful. But actually, if anybody's like me, just needs a beat to like process it. So what we're going to do is just throw us all into breakout room for 5 minutes, just to try and sort of grab our thoughts together, because I think there's some really important questions and to continue. But would you be okay if we just take 5 minutes together? I think just to ask each other what was the thing that jumped out at us. There's been a couple of things I've written down that I really want to get my head around, and then we're going to come back in, and from those groups some of those questions might have kind of pulled together. So Simon, will you just throw us in kind of 5s or 6s? Don't disappear. You don't have to say anything, but just I think it might be really helpful to just reflect back to one another what we've heard, and then maybe even together just come up with some questions that would be really helpful. So Simon, will you do that for us? So I just want to encourage you, do use the chat there. If there's anything that's come up in your groups while you were chatting, will you throw it in, even if it's just a comment or a reflection you want to add. We'll take a few minutes here. I'll kick us off. Is Mark back? Can I see him? There you are. Mark, the thing for us, that as we were chatting there, and a thing that I wrote down was just that statement that you made, COVID-19 is a sign the world is changing. And I was struck in myself. I have sort of almost the reaction in myself at realizing that in many ways we've been preparing ourselves wrongly, because so much of our hope has been getting just this being over and getting through this and getting back to normal. And I think what you said is so helpful, like that a new normal is not really actually that helpful at the minute. And I think I'm struck that I have to do a bit of processing myself, even in terms of my own posturing towards where we're at and where we're headed. And I think recognizing that a lot of people's hope in this season has been, just this being over. But like you said, here you are in Melbourne back in lockdown, and the reality that that's not going to happen anytime soon. And so we're just talking about, what does it look like to lead in that space? How do we help others make that transition? And it's quite a shock in some ways to the system, and to make that shift.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there was a virus before the virus. And to be completely honest, like what I was trying to do was go around the world and encourage people, like, hang on, how we're doing things is not going to turn this around. Secularism that was going across the world, it's not just a Western secularism. Like in the last 12 months, I've spoken to people in, from different cities in Kenya to South America to all over the place. This thing is growing. And people are coming to church less. Like we had this thing where I think it was one of the denominations here now says regular attendance is once a month. Like, so people coming once a month and us putting a nice program on for them, that's going to turn secularism around. And so something had to shake up, so in a sense, like what has this done? This has made us not like, we could base our leadership upon good management practices. And Martin Lloyd-Jones in the 1960s said that as he saw, he called it American business practices coming to the church in Britain, what space was that going to leave for the Holy Spirit? And it's a really good question. And how much, have we all taken that on in a way where we think we can plan? And I think what the pandemic has done is shown how much we're not in control and how much more we actually need to be dependent upon Him. And what is absolutely having a buzzsaw taken to it is individualism. But what is the most confronting thing? It's our individualism and our self-reliancy and our myth of freedom and our myth of control that the Holy Spirit is allowing to come under the oxyacetylene torch at this point in time. And so what is the posture that then the Holy Spirit is asking us to take when we're not in control? And maybe the church in the two-thirds world has been outgrowing the church in the West because they realize they're less in control than us.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Mark. Owen, have you?
Yeah, lots of great questions coming in the chat. Hopefully everyone can see those. I'm just gonna. You mentioned Fraser earlier on. Hi Mark, could you unpack the religiosity versus oh my word. There are religious elements to secularism, though not Godward, for example, devotion, intolerance, etc. Any thoughts on how we use insights here to connect? And any good references on your Quebec example?
I'll come back to Quebec. I might send something. I'll try and look up things and send it through later. I think we're seeing this cultural divide, where what you're seeing in secularism is a secularism without values eventually becomes religious, and I think we're seeing that. And everything from, you'd almost say there's an increasingly like neo-Victorian puritanical sort of like tone to much of contemporary secular sort of morality, where a lot of it's become sort of finger pointing at other people. So in a sense, you have that in play in the culture. And I think what that does is so many people actually are looking for grace. There are so many people who are literally paralyzed, increasingly at workplaces as well, of saying the wrong thing or something from their past coming against them. And they're literally afraid to speak at this point in time. So in many ways, and Tom Holland's written a book, Dominion, where, he talks about so many of the things in the contemporary world are actually Christian elements of what this sort of progressive secular thing is. But what's missing is that grace forgiveness message in the midst of that. So I think there's an evangelistic opening that's coming for people to actually go to spaces where they're not going to be judged, which is ironic, and is an opening, particularly in the Republic of Ireland, because how people are seeing church I don't want a part of that because it's been this religiously intolerant place. But perhaps there is a future space for churches where, as the culture changes, and I think people are going to push more into, or elements particularly of the elites and different bureaucracies which run different things, is going to be an increasing space for people to feel grace. I don't know how well I answered that, but yeah.
Thanks. That's good, Mark. Off the back of that, I think as well, just one of the questions, and I had written it down myself. You talked about the research for Gen Z and their shift in kind of how they see the world and their needs. And I mean, there's no doubt there's like this year has seen a massive shift in how Gen Z have engaged with church, and I suppose the opportunities presented to us to listen to to where they're at. And Gavin has asked the question as well about how do we sort of preemptively help young people who are feeling that pinch point between new secular progressive Ireland and the church. And I think just that opportunity to engage with that generation. Is there anything that you can speak to?
Yeah, I think there's they live their lives very much online. The online network is their natural habitat, and the online network is not monolithic. And what I'm finding is you find people completely everywhere. You can find someone who's completely in the progressive Ireland thing. I'm shocked to find more and more people I'm having to deal with who are like almost on the far right, which is something I'm not used to, and that's becoming big. There's some evidence that's saying that Gen Z is the most conservative generation in the last few cohorts. So that's another possibility. That we could see. So I think, understand the internet reality that they're on, which I think has just been sped up. but there's also conversations to be had that I think they're asking questions. And in many ways, they're looking at the world and they're deeply, deeply discontent with where the world is going. And I think there's a point as well that we're going to come to soon when people realize that actually a lot of the big movements for change in the world actually aren't bringing renewal. So I think there could be a sort of nihilistic future point where I think it's going to be a lot of evangelistic conversations and conversations with young people of faith who can go deeper with Gen Z. So we've got to walk with Gen Z over a period. I mean, I'm still walking with millennials, who I was talking to when I was 16, and now they've got kids, so it's a lifelong journey with people.
Great. Probably a few questions tap into this, but in chapter 11 of your book, Reappearing Church, you speak about repatterning ourselves for renewal, addressing where our habits have been hijacked and nurturing new ones, or digging old wells. I suppose maybe that's what you mean by retrieval in terms of what you've said today. What's that look like for Red Church in terms of your own retrieval and digging new old or redigging old wells what's that look like? What's that been like for you as a community?
Yeah, it's been so interesting, like how the pandemic throw out patterns, and that's probably some of my comments around practices and patterns. How so many of our patterns were not transferable into the pandemic, and literally we saw people who were pushing into patterns, and then when the broader pattern of the culture changed, it just created this disruption moment. So in many ways, we're at a moment of seeking God. It's like, what are the next patterns of the next era? And I sort of feel like, in some ways, I think that I'm rethinking a lot of the patterns thing. Like, I still think patterns are important, but I just think they also. I'm seeing some at the moment in the midst of the pandemic, people grabbing onto patterns as a form of control of a smaller world to help them get through the lack of control in the bigger world. So I'm sort of walking through and reassessing some of that at the moment. I still read my Bible every day. We believe in prayer. So, like all these things. So I'm not throwing those things up in the air. But I think patterns as a front-facing, that's going to be the bow of the ship that cuts through the ice. I'm not so sure. I think they follow on, but I think there's a mood in the Christian subculture at the moment where patterns are going to do it all. But I think the pandemic is disrupting that somewhat.
Mark, maybe you could say a little bit more to us. I mean, I think anybody who wants to get their hands on Fraser's book can still do that. Yes, and it's really worth a read, and just some of those things you picked up on, and this picture, I think this idea of retrieval, of sort of going back even further, and in some ways it's you talked about the tough landscape that we face in Ireland and that we've been in for quite some time, and so in some ways sometimes it's hard to think about what retrieval looks like. So what would some of those things actually be? Because in a sense, that whole scale rejection of religion in our culture as the church, I think, is causing us to think, well, we have to do everything new and everything different. So can you talk a little bit more to us about that picture for Ireland, and maybe even just a bit prophetically what you sense for us that looks like?
I had this moment like at the beginning of the pandemic. There's a park at the end of my street which I'd never go to, and it's a really weird park in the sense that we're in the city here, and it's built up, and but there's these people who gave their house, and their property this farm was on, they let it go and they gave it to the local council, and it's like Australian bush. It's the only Australian bush sort of like this sort of in this little area. I never would go there, but then you're walking around. I can only go 5 kilometers, so I went there every day. And it was so bizarre because I'm used to being in all these cities around the world, and I'm in this little bush. And one day I just thought, I'm going to read a local history on what happened here. And basically I discovered that just around here, there was about 5 families who moved into this very dense forest. And it was really interesting. And 2 of them, basically, one was a guy from Surrey, Silas Pagdam, and another guy was a guy, Anthony Smith, who was a freed African-American slave, freed by the Quakers and sent to Australia. These few families all look back to an older history that they have, which is the Methodist revival. And here in the Australian bush, these different groups, Americans, Australians, they all start, Americans, people from the UK, they start meeting and they start building this community of faith here, literally in this little forest. And for me, it was this little thing. It's not a big revival. It's not an amazing renewal. It's not the Great Awakening. But for me, it was this untold story of faith, which I'd never noticed in my area until I stopped because of the pandemic. You know, I'd always thinking I'm in some big place and trying to work out what's happening in the city. And I just felt like there's these, before, if you go back even further, there's these stories. And I think about Ireland, I think about this moment where we are. We're at a moment when, in some sense, the global network that we're in is being disrupted. Ireland had a key moment in late antiquity, dark ages, whatever you want to call it, when the global network of the Roman road, the Roman postal system, was radically disrupted. And actually the dominant global order of the age began to fall to a rising power in the East. And the defining narrative of that story began to actually fall down. And the Christian world seemed to be in retreat as paganism seemed to spring up again. And in many ways, Ireland went from the fringe to actually the front line of innovation as it was a kind of rebuilding. How did that happen? It actually happened as people were drawn to, and many of the cities were actually people drawn to someone of extraordinary faith who was trying to almost get away from other people. But people started gathering around them because of actually their red hot faith and their spiritual authority. The cut-through currency of the networked world is going to be spiritual authority. It's the one thing which cannot actually be commodified or objectified or digitized. It's this cut-through thing. And so Ireland has this deep, deep inspiring, and often you don't see your own thing. One of the best stories I ever heard about Australia was from Martin Robinson, the director of the Bible Society UK, who came out and just saw all these things that I didn't see about the history of my own country. So for me in Ireland, yes, there is all the things of the Catholic Church. Yes, there is all the things of a divided Ireland. But if you go back further, right back to the beginning of the Retrieval, there's incredible spiritual DNA around devotion of prayer, a radical way of thinking about mission and ministry, small communities which are actually growing up, which looks a lot like perhaps what could be happening now. And the fact that maybe in Dublin, you can't grow a church as big as you can in London, well, maybe that's actually what the new era actually looks like. And maybe you're not behind, maybe you're actually in front. And so maybe there actually needs to be a reframing that perhaps Ireland has been in grey zone for a really long time. And that's actually prepared people for the global situation that people are going to head into.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'm just scanning down these questions. If there's anything we've missed, I think I just see Roy ask a couple of questions in relation to mission, and he's asking, does the church need cultural analysts in its gift set for mission? It seems like, you know, at this particular moment in time, it is a really important thing to be able to do and to think about.
I think that there is a need for cultural analysts, but only a few of them. Because it's not everyone's not called to this. But what we need more than cultural analysts is actually people who can serve their communities and be the hands and feet of Jesus in areas, who can be a listening ear, someone who shares the gospel over a pint, who can listen to a neighbor, go and visit someone who's been locked away and feeling the isolation of a world which didn't prepare them with a social net. So in a sense, I think, yes, we do need social analysts, and I'm excited for what's going to come out of that space in Ireland, particularly being at that front line. But also, I just think that there is tremendous mission opportunities coming out of this pandemic, in grey zone. Everything's up. In grey zone, everything's up in the air. Everything's questioned. And so people are questioning the dominant order. Yes, there are people in your churches perhaps questioning their faith, but equally there's people questioning faith of what the experts are saying, what the elites are saying, what the dominant story of the culture is saying. So this is, in many ways, much more like a first century environment that we're in.
Do you think that
it's a mission-rich environment?
Yeah, so do you think then, like, as leaders, rather than maybe our primary question and concern being how do we get back to gathering in a building should be some of those conversations around what does mission look like in this new era, and in Praxis we talk a lot about collaboration, and so how even here in Ireland, how can we begin to do that a bit more collaboratively?
Oh, I just think, look, I mean, it's such a cliche, but it's a brilliant cliche. Crisis, the Chinese character for crisis is, also opportunity. And I just think that there is just such incredible opportunities in this moment for the sharing of the good news. And sadly, there's countries around the world where the church has not done well in the pandemic. I was speaking to one country where they've had 2 of their major outbreaks has come from churches doing silly things and breaking restrictions. But then there's also opportunities in other places where the churches is able to be a servant. And so I think that is something that cuts through. And just one thing I always say, there's the public realm, there's the Twitter sphere, there's what's said on TV up here, which seems like it's absolutely, breathing fire upon the church. But then there's the street, there's the neighborhood down here. And this is actually a different realm. And this is actually the space that the church is built for. Yep, there's the analysts, there's the people who need to be public proclaimers of the truth up there in the public space. That's important. But the majority of us actually, it's the person at the bus stop, and we're equipped for that. And I think that what you guys have had to push into is actually that kind of, very community mission stuff. You've been prepared for this.
Owen, do you want to finish this up?
Yeah, I'd love to share a prayer that maybe we could pray together. Is that okay? We do it that way? Let's maybe just take a moment to be still. And there'll be all kinds of things that we'll have left with today, we'll be leaving with today, but just take a moment to be still and just to be open to the Spirit of God. And we just pray, Lord, fill us. Renew us. Meet us in our questions, in our grief, in the grey zone. We turn to you. We look to you, rely on you. Maybe we just pray together. Christ, our guide, stay with us on our pilgrimage through life. When we falter, encourage us. When we stumble, steady us. And when we have fallen, pick us up. Give us courage to face our present and future together. Give us patience with ourselves and others. And Lord, help us to become step by step more truly ourselves, and remind us that you have travelled this way before us. Amen.
Amen. Just for all of those people who've been messaging and panicking, we have recorded the session, and we'll share this recording with you if you've registered for the webinar. So for anybody whose hand is about to fall off from frantically note taking, don't worry, you'll get a chance to listen back and look over this. So just, all that to say, Mark, thank you so much. It was so rich. There was so much in that. And also it was actually just really encouraging. I think what you said about sometimes somebody from outside who sees your story and is able to speak into it, I've just really appreciated that as well, in the midst of kind of all the things that we're journeying and questioning. And just to remind you all, as Anne has stuck up the links there, if you want to grab a copy of Fraser's book, it's there at the Praxis website, and Mark's books as well, which we highly recommend grabbing a hold of. Don't forget, on the 22nd of June, we're going to be back for our last of these webinars with Brian Sanders, so do register for that as well. So all that to say thank you so much, and thanks everybody else for being with us this morning. And hope the rest of the book goes well, Mark, writing.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Many blessings.
Thank you so much. All right. Bye. Have a good day.